Some days start with the kind of quiet chaos that nobody notices until it erupts into something unforgettable. That's exactly what happened on a humid Thursday afternoon in a packed bank branch on the edge of downtown Los Angeles. The air was thick with the hum of restless customers, the faint tapping of keyboards, and the occasional rustle of papers as people shifted impatiently in line. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to be in a hurry to leave, yet nobody could escape the slow grind of bureaucracy. Amid the crowd stood Clara Evans, a wiry elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her hands clutching a worn leather purse as if it were her lifeline. She'd come to the bank with a simple hope, to fix a mistake that had drained her meager savings. But her trembling fingers betrayed the anxiety gnawing at her. Clara had lived a modest life, piecing together a widow's pension and odd jobs, and now, at 78, she was facing the kind of problem that felt like a personal betrayal. Across town, Leonardo DiCaprio, the Hollywood icon known as much for his environmental crusades as his Oscar-worthy roles, had just wrapped up a meeting with a local charity. Dressed in a faded gray hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, he looked more like a regular guy than a global superstar. He'd stepped into the bank to handle a quick errand, blending into the crowd unnoticed, until Clara's quiet struggle caught his attention, setting the stage for a moment that would leave everyone in the room stunned. The line in the bank snaked around a maze of velvet ropes, and Clara Evans stood near the back, her posture slightly hunched from years of carrying more weight than her frame should have allowed. She'd been there for nearly an hour, watching the digital clock above the teller's counter tick forward with agonizing slowness, each minute amplifying the knot in her stomach. In her purse, she carried a crumpled bank statement, its numbers glaring back at her like a cruel joke. Her balance had plummeted after a series of unexplained withdrawals, leaving her with barely enough to cover rent. She'd called the bank's helpline twice already, but the automated voice had only directed her to visit in person, and now here she was, surrounded by the low murmur of frustration from other customers who seemed just as fed up. Up ahead, a teller named Jessica Riley, a woman in her late 20s with sharp cheekbones and a headset perched on her head, waved the next person forward with a flick of her wrist. Her movements were brisk, almost mechanical, as if she'd long since stopped seeing the faces in front of her as anything more than transactions to process. When Clara finally reached the counter, she slid her statement across the scratched surface, her voice soft but steady as she began to explain her situation. "Good afternoon. I'm here because there's something wrong with my account. I've been charged fees I don't understand, and it's taken almost everything I had left." Jessica barely glanced up from her screen, her fingers continuing to tap at the keyboard as she responded in a flat tone. "Let me check, ma'am, but if it's on the statement, it's probably just standard maintenance fees. They apply to everyone." Clara's brow furrowed, and she leaned forward slightly, trying to catch Jessica's eye. "But I've had this account for years, and it's never been like this before. I can't afford to lose this much. It's all I have." Jessica let out a small, exasperated sigh, loud enough for the people nearby to turn their heads, and her lips pressed into a thin line as she finally met Clara's gaze. "Look, ma'am, I don't set the rules, I just follow them. If you didn't keep enough in there, the system adds the charges. It's not my fault you didn't read the fine print." The words landed like a slap, and Clara's hands tightened around her purse, her knuckles whitening as she struggled to keep her composure. A few customers behind her shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Clara and the teller, while others whispered to each other, their voices a low hum of judgment. Across the room, Leonardo DiCaprio stood near an ATM, his cap still pulled low, pretending to check his phone as he listened to the exchange unfold. He'd come to deposit a check from a recent speaking gig, a routine task he preferred to handle himself rather than delegate. But now his attention was fixed on Clara, her quiet dignity clashing with Jessica's dismissive attitude. He slipped his phone into his pocket and took a step closer, his jaw tightening as he watched Clara try again, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want to know why this happened. I need that money to live." Jessica rolled her eyes, a gesture so blatant it drew a sharp intake of breath from an older man standing nearby, and she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "If you can't manage your account, maybe you should switch to something simpler. I can't undo what's already done. It's in the system. The air around the counter grew heavy, charged with the unspoken tension of a dozen onlookers who now watched Clara shrink under the weight of Jessica's words, her shoulders slumping as she stared at the statement in front of her, searching for a response she couldn't find. Leonardo's hands curled into loose fists at his sides, his calm demeanor giving way to a flicker of anger as he decided he'd heard enough, the scene pulling him into a conflict he hadn't expected to join. The bank's atmosphere thickened as Clara Evans stood frozen at the counter, her hands still gripping the edges of her crumpled statement, while Jessica Riley's dismissive words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The elderly woman's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, her gray eyes darting from the paper to the teller and back again, as if she could will the numbers to change through sheer determination. Around her, the crowd's attention sharpened. Some customers shifted their weight, craning their necks to get a better view, while others lowered their voices, their whispers forming a jagged undercurrent of curiosity and unease. Jessica, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but her expression taut, like someone who'd grown used to brushing off complaints with the same rehearsed indifference. She tapped a pen against the counter, the sound a deliberate punctuation to her earlier remarks, and glanced at Clara with a look that suggested this was just another inconvenience in her day. "Ma'am, I've already explained it. The fees are automatic. If you've got a problem with that, you can file a complaint online, but I'm telling you now, it won't change anything," Jessica said, her tone clipped and final, as if she were closing a door Clara hadn't even knocked on. Clara's lips parted, her breath catching as she tried to muster a response, her voice barely audible when she finally spoke. "I don't have a computer, I don't know how to do that. I just need someone to help me fix this, please." The plea was quiet, almost swallowed by the hum of the room, but it carried a raw edge that made a woman in a blue coat nearby look down at her shoes, uncomfortable with the vulnerability on display. Jessica's eyebrows lifted slightly, a faint smirk tugging at her mouth as she shrugged. "Well, that's not my problem. I can't hold your hand through everything. We've got a line here." The casual cruelty of it stung, and Clara's hands trembled as she folded the statement, her fingers fumbling with the paper as she fought to keep her dignity intact. Behind her, Leonardo DiCaprio stood near the edge of the crowd, his hoodie blending him into the sea of faces, though his presence was starting to draw subtle glances from those who'd caught a glimpse of his profile beneath the cap. He'd been listening intently, his head tilted as he absorbed every word, every gesture, his expression shifting from quiet observation to something harder, more focused. The contrast between Clara's frail persistence and Jessica's cold authority gnawed at him, stirring a restlessness he couldn't ignore. He noticed the way Clara's shoulders hunched further with each dismissive remark, the way her eyes flickered with a mix of fear and resolve, and it struck him how easily someone in her position could be erased by a system that didn't care to look twice. The bank employees bustling behind the counter seemed oblivious to the mounting tension, their movements quick and detached, but the customers around Clara were less discreet. Some nodded sympathetically, while others exchanged knowing looks, as if they'd seen this play out before. A man in a suit near the front muttered to his companion, "They always pick on the ones who can't fight back," his voice low but carrying just far enough to reach Leonardo's ears. It was that comment, paired with Jessica's unrelenting stance, that pushed him closer to the counter, his steps slow but deliberate, his hands slipping out of his pockets as he prepared to intervene. Clara, unaware of the figure approaching, tried one last time, her voice cracking as she spoke. "I've been with this bank for 30 years. I've never missed a payment. I just don't understand why this is happening now." Jessica cut her off with a sharp wave of her hand, her patience visibly fraying. 30 years or not, rules are rules. If you can't keep up, that's on you, not us. The words landed like a final blow, and Clara's face crumpled, her resolve buckling under the weight of being dismissed so thoroughly, the room's attention now a spotlight she couldn't escape. Leonardo's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he closed the distance, the air around him crackling with an intent that no one, not Clara, not Jessica, not the whispering onlookers, could have anticipated. The bank's hum of activity faltered as Leonardo DiCaprio stepped up to the counter, his presence slicing through the tension like a sudden shift in the room's gravity, though he kept his movements unhurried, almost casual, as if he were just another customer with a question. Clara Evans stood there, her hands still clutching the folded statement, her eyes glistening with the strain of holding back tears, while Jessica Riley froze mid-motion, her pen hovering over a clipboard, her smirk fading as she registered the man now standing beside Clara. The crowd's whispers swelled into a chaotic ripple, heads turning, phones slipping out of pockets as people squinted to confirm what they thought they saw. Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor whose face had graced countless screens, now here, in a faded hoodie, his cap still low but no longer enough to hide his identity. He tilted his head toward Jessica, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made the air feel heavier. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The question hung there, simple yet loaded, and Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, her fingers tightening around the pen as she struggled to find her footing. I'm just doing my job, sir. She's upset about fees, but it's policy. I don't make the rules," she stammered, her earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of his gaze. Leonardo's eyes flicked to Clara, softening for a moment as he took in her crumpled posture, then back to Jessica, hardening again as he leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the counter. "Your job is to help people, not make them feel like nothing. She's asking for an explanation, not a lecture. So why don't you start by looking at her account instead of shutting her down?" Clara blinked up at him, her breath catching as recognition dawned, her hands loosening around the statement as she processed that this stranger, someone she'd only ever seen in movies, was stepping into her fight. Jessica's face flushed, her eyes darting to the side as if hoping a manager would materialize to rescue her, but no one came, and the silence stretched, broken only by the faint rustle of the crowd shifting closer. "I've already checked. It's just standard fees. There's nothing I can do," Jessica said, her voice quieter now, less certain. But Leonardo shook his head, reaching for the statement Clara still held. "Let me see it," he said gently, and Clara hesitated, then handed it over, her fingers brushing his as she did, her expression a mix of confusion and fragile hope. He unfolded the paper, scanning the numbers, his brow furrowing as he traced the lines of charges. Hundreds of dollars siphoned away in small, relentless increments. He looked up at Jessica, his tone steady but firm. "These aren't standard, they're excessive, and they started 3 months ago. So tell me, what changed in your system to triple her costs without notice?" Jessica swallowed hard, glancing at her screen as if it might offer an escape, but before she could answer, a man in a pressed suit, Mark Hensley, the branch manager, pushed through the crowd, his strides quick and purposeful, his face a mask of forced calm. "What's going on here?" Mark demanded, his eyes narrowing at Leonardo, then widening as he realized who he was facing. "Mr. DiCaprio, I didn't know you were here. Is there a problem?" Leonardo didn't flinch, holding up the statement as he turned to face Mark. "Yeah, there's a problem. This woman's being charged fees that don't make sense, and your staff's treating her like she doesn't matter. So you tell me, is this how you run things?" Mark's jaw tightened, his hands smoothing his tie as he shot Jessica a quick, irritated look. "We'll look into it, sir, but our policies are clear. Customers are responsible for understanding their accounts." Leonardo's voice dropped, not loud but piercing, as he stepped closer to Mark. "Clear to who? She's been here 30 years, and suddenly she's losing everything. You think that's fair?" The manager opened his mouth to argue, but Leonardo cut him off, pulling out his phone and tapping the screen. "I'm recording this. Let's see what your system says when you actually check it, because if this is a mistake, you fix it now, and if it's not, I'm calling every news outlet I know." The room went still, Mark's face paling as he registered the threat, and Clara's eyes widened, her hands clasping together as she watched Leonardo take control, the unexpected shift leaving everyone, Jessica, Mark, the onlookers, reeling, unsure of what he'd uncover next. The bank's air grew stifling as Leonardo DiCaprio stood firm at the counter, his phone held steady in one hand, the screen glowing with the promise of exposure, while his other hand rested on Clara Evans' statement, its creased edges now a silent testament to the fight unfolding. Mark Hensley, the branch manager, wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his fingers fumbling with his tie as he glanced between Leonardo and the crowd, their phones now raised, capturing every second of the standoff. Jessica Riley shrank back in her chair, her earlier defiance replaced by a nervous fidgeting with her headset, her eyes darting to Mark for some kind of lifeline. But he was too busy grappling with the sudden shift in power to notice. Clara stood beside Leonardo, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her breath shallow as she watched him challenge the system that had dismissed her so easily, her mind racing to catch up with the reality that this man, someone she'd only known from movie posters, was here, fighting for her. Leonardo's voice cut through the tension, calm but unyielding as he addressed Mark directly. You've got two choices. You can pull up her account and figure out what's going on right now, or I hit send on this video, and every news station from here to New York gets a front row seat to how you treat your customers. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands hovering over the counter as if he could physically push the situation back under control, but the weight of dozens of eyes, and the threat of public humiliation, forced his hand. All right, let's just take a look. No need to escalate this, he muttered, gesturing for Jessica to pull up Clara's records, his tone clipped with irritation but laced with something closer to panic. Jessica's fingers flew across the keyboard, her movements jerky as she navigated the system, the screen reflecting in her wide eyes as she muttered under her breath. It's loading. Give me a second. The room held its breath, the only sounds the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of feet as customers leaned closer, their curiosity now outweighing their impatience. After a tense minute, Jessica straightened, her voice faltering as she spoke. There's something off. These fees, they're not just maintenance, they're tied to a new program. It's been hitting accounts under a certain balance, mostly older clients. Mark shot her a sharp look, but Leonardo seized the opening, his tone steady as he pressed forward. A program? So you're saying this isn't a mistake, it's deliberate. How many people are getting charged like this? Mark hesitated, his hands balling into fists at his sides, but the pressure of Leonardo's unwavering stare, and the phone still recording, cracked his resolve. It's a few hundred, maybe more. It was meant to offset losses. I didn't design it. It came from higher up, he admitted, his voice low, almost swallowed by the murmurs rippling through the crowd. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming as she processed the scale of it, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. So it's not just me. You've been taking from all of us. How could you do that? Leonardo turned to her, his expression softening as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, then faced Mark again, his words deliberate. You're going to reverse every single one of these charges, not just hers, and you're going to tell your bosses exactly what happened here today, because this stops now. Mark nodded quickly, his face ashen as he stammered. We'll fix it. I'll make the calls. It'll be done by tomorrow. The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and scattered applause, some nodding in approval, while others exchanged stunned looks, their whispers turning to open conversation about what they'd just witnessed. Clara looked up at Leonardo, tears spilling over as she gripped his arm. I don't know how to thank you. I thought I was alone in this. I never imagined anyone would care enough to step in. He offered a small, genuine smile, his voice quiet as he replied, You shouldn't have to fight this hard just to be heard. No one should. As Mark retreated to his office, already dialing his superiors, and Jessica began processing the reversal on Clara's account, Leonardo slipped his phone back into his pocket, the video unsent, but its impact undeniable. The bank staff moved with newfound urgency, their indifference replaced by a scramble to undo the damage, while customers lined up to check their own statements, their voices buzzing with questions and relief. Clara left that day with her money restored and a formal apology from the bank. But more than that, she walked out with her head higher, her steps steadier, forever changed by the stranger who'd seen her worth when no one else had. The onlookers lingered, recounting the scene to each other, how Leonardo had turned the tables, how Clara had found her voice, and their words carried a quiet awe, a reminder that respect isn't a privilege to be earned, but a right to be demanded.